Welcome to the Online Success Journey Podcast, your opportunity to discover and learn from entrepreneurs like yourself. This is not your typical podcast, but a place where you can get the real story and find out how real people encounter speed bumps and detours, but journey through to find success. Now here's your host for the Online Success Journey Podcast, Patience.
Hello everyone and welcome to Online Success Journey. This is episode 88. Are you ready to join the clan? Today we have Robert Klinck, the best-selling author and the intellectual property attorney who helps entrepreneurs, startups, and the inventors harness the power of their intellectual property rights and reduce exposure to lawsuits. Hello, Robert.
Hello. I'm happy to be here.
We are happy to have you. I know the clan here is anxious to hear your story, so let's get started with basics. Can you tell my clan a little bit about your background, about what you did before you started your online business? Take us right up to the last job or business before you are online.
Okay. I'm in the United States. I was born and raised in deep South Texas, and I stayed in Texas to do college. Then I went up to Cambridge, Massachusetts to get my law degree from Harvard Law School. After that, I started in a very kind of traditional route for lawyers. I worked at a very big firm with about 2,000 lawyers representing big companies in disputes that involved lots and lots of money, and never really working with or even dealing with kind of the little guy or people who were individual entrepreneurs. And I did that for a while. I spent about 5 years at two different firms, but they were very much in the same model. And then I made a big change at that point, which is actually a pretty typical thing for lawyers at those types of big firms. I went and became a federal prosecutor and handled criminal cases here representing the United States. And the reason to do that is because it gives you more hands-on experience than you get at these big firms, and you get responsibility and are in charge. And so I did that for about 3 years. And as I was going to transition out of that role, I had to decide what to do with my life. And I talked to the firm I'd been at before. They offered me the opportunity to go back and rejoin the firm. But then I also just started looking around, and I found a very small law firm with two other lawyers that had started a couple of years earlier that just looked really interesting. They weren't necessarily working with entrepreneurs, but they were representing smaller clients, but in very big cases. And I talked with them, and it sounded interesting because it gave me an opportunity to be entrepreneurial. I would be helping to build this business and really be an integral part in helping to develop how that law firm developed over time. So I joined them. At the time I joined them, though, I made a fundamental mistake that many entrepreneurs make. We didn't get a good written document in place that set out how it was going to all work. I had a letter from them that essentially said that, they would pay me X dollars, but I understood they didn't have regular cash flow, so I would only get paid when the firm had money, et cetera. But we didn't address the question of how I would ultimately become part of the firm and become a member or a partner. And so I worked there for about 4 years. Everything went fine. At that point, I got involved with intellectual property cases. It was my first foray into that area, and I loved it. I was kind of bit right away with the idea and working on those types of issues. And I was treated fairly the whole time working there. However, fast forward about 3.5 years later, my wife got pregnant. And so I went to the two other lawyers and I said, hey, we need to talk about formalizing our agreement and getting me to actually be a partner and figure that out. And for about 6 or 7 months, I think we kind of went back and forth. And unfortunately, we couldn't come to the point of actually coming to an agreement and getting to the point that we could all be happy with the numbers. And so I found myself with a 2-month-old baby having to make the decision to leave and not know what I was going to do at that point. But I went out and started my own business, and it was a law firm. I made some classic mistakes that a lot of entrepreneurs make. in the early years of my own law firm. I didn't try to go down and niche down to a very particular type of client or even a particular area of law. I tried to say I did just about everything for just about anyone, and that didn't work. But I learned the lesson. And I would say about 2 or 3 years ago, I was introduced to the world of entrepreneurship podcasts. And I think the first foray, I started with a podcast called The Good Life Project, which is a former lawyer. And then that led me down the road. And eventually I started listening to Entrepreneur on Fire with John Lee Dumas. And that podcast just gave me a shift in my perspective. And that's when I started to transition so that I was no longer a lawyer who happened to own a business, but instead I was an entrepreneur with an online presence, with an online business who happened to be a lawyer. And so that's my path. That's how I got to where I am. And now I still do client representation in a very traditional sense, but I also offer quite a bit of online content in the traditional online marketing mold of doing inbound with content marketing and then lead magnets, et cetera. And I'm in the process of developing an online course that will hopefully allow entrepreneurs to avoid having to hire lawyers in the first place. They can take the course and they can then get some templates and be able to do what they need to do to protect themselves and protect their genius.
Wow. What a journey, Robert. Well, you learned your big mistakes you have done and things didn't work. What is the biggest legal mistake that business owners make?
Well, one of the biggest mistakes is, ironically, the mistake that I made of not having their agreements in writing. And that can be a legal mistake. It's also just a business mistake, though, because part of the problem is that often, especially if you're working with someone else, if you have a partner, you may not actually have the same understanding of what the agreement is. And it's not because one person's right and one person's wrong. I mean, I guess one person ultimately is, but it's just that the two people didn't actually have the same understanding. And the act of actually writing it down and putting it down on paper and say, how much each person owns, how much they will get of the profit, what their responsibilities are, all of those things, the process of doing that will make sure that you're on the same page. But it will also avoid a costly fight down the road. When I made the decision to leave, and we didn't have a lawsuit, we didn't have a fight about it, but it did strain the relationship I had with these two lawyers who I thought of as my friends and the people who I was kind of in the trenches with. I mean, one of them literally had flown to the Bahamas in the middle of Hurricane Sandy to get to my wedding. I don't know, about a year and a half before we had the breakdown. And so that relationship became very strained, even though it was a close relationship. And that's the kind of thing that can happen. And it can also have some very costly consequences for you. There is a famous case here in the United States of the media personality Adam Carolla, who started his own podcast with a friend, someone he'd been friends with from high school, who, the friend I think was doing the behind the scenes, the producing and all of that. The podcast became insanely successful, was at one point the most downloaded podcast in the world, and was making a lot of money. At which point Adam Carolla believed his friend was really just an employee and fired him and said, "You're fired." And his friend said, No, I'm a partner in this business. That they, after about a year of going back and forth, the partner sued him. And then they spent 18 months fighting in court, definitely spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe even $1 million on lawyers for something that they could have had in a written agreement for, $50, and it would have clearly said what the responsibility was and what the roles were. So that's one of the biggest mistakes. It also has consequences for intellectual property. So, for example, if you have an employee who is creating or an independent contractor who is creating designs for you, creating written work for you, and they haven't signed a document saying that they are transferring or assigning, that's the word in intellectual property, but transferring the rights to that to you, they could later come out of the woodwork and say, no, that's mine still. And you might have an expensive fight down the road. So again, getting your agreements in writing is one of the big piece of advice I give to every entrepreneur, and it's one of the biggest mistakes I see entrepreneurs making.
Wow. The world is changing. Okay. Why do you do what you do?
Well, it's an interesting question. I became a lawyer. I had decided by high school that I was going to become a lawyer because I started participating in some public speaking competitions, which had led me to some legally related events. And that led me to think I wanted to be a lawyer. I had this idea that I was going to be like Perry Mason in the courtroom and doing all those things. Well, very few lawyers actually do that. So I got out of law school, and it took me a while to find what I really wanted to do. But what I found is when I first started, I was actually representing people at the tail end of disputes after the first court had already decided the issue. And through the course of my career, what I've done is move earlier and earlier and earlier in the process because I've been frustrated by seeing that you could have avoided this situation if the person before me just hadn't made a mistake. And so I moved earlier and earlier. And now what I try to do is to try to help entrepreneurs avoid having a dispute altogether because that gives me the most joy. It gives me pleasure. Why I have the particular focus I do is as I mentioned at my prior firm, I just kind of fell into it. And that's actually a common story for lawyers, that you don't necessarily have a specific plan of where you end up, but you work on some matters and they're interesting. So that's what happened with me with intellectual property. And then in working with a coach, a business coach, at some point after I had my own firm, she asked me, she said, well, what kind of lawyer are you? And I said, well, I'm going to stick a stake in the ground. I'm an intellectual property lawyer. And she said, well, what industry do you want to focus on? And she had in mind that I would say something like Internet of Things or social media or some kind of established industry. And instead, in thinking it through and really giving myself the time to decide what I wanted to do, I decided what I wanted to do was work with entrepreneurs because they have an excitement, they have an energy that I can feed off of. But also I get to see an immediate impact because I'm going to be working with people who very much need my services. And it's not just working on behalf of some big company. It's working on behalf of, it might be a solopreneur. It might be someone who has a couple of employees, but helping someone in a very tangible way. And that gives me a lot of energy, and it makes it easy for me to get up in the morning to do what I do.
Wow. Okay. You talked about we needed to have the legal documents. We have to have it written down. What types of written agreement should the business have?
Well, so the rule of thumb you should really apply is any important agreement you have should be in writing. So that it's hard to say because all businesses are different, but there are some that you definitely need to have. You should have, if you have a corporation or a partnership, you need to have the basic foundation documents. So that would be an operating agreement or something that sets out who owns what the roles are. But it would also set out what happens if someone is unhappy. So there's a classic idea called a buy-sell agreement, and you can choose different ways of doing that. But the idea is, what happens if you have two partners and one of them says, hey, I want to get out of this business, and the other one says, no, I want to keep doing it. Well, how do you figure out how to work that out? That's done through a buy-sell agreement that would be part of your agreement. But you also have to have something in there that says what happens if one of the partners or participants dies, becomes disabled, or all of those types of negative consequences. So that's the formation documents. Separately, you need to have written agreements with any employees or contractors you use. And the reason for that, there's a couple of them. One, if you have a written agreement that clearly says they're an employee, not a partner, it prevents them from later suing and say they own part of the business. Two, that's the only way you can have them transfer all of their rights in any intellectual property they're creating to the business. So that's an important piece. And finally, in those agreements, you should have a confidentiality provision that says your employees can't take anything they learn working for you and then use that for anybody else. So they can't compete against you. They can't start their own company, et cetera. And that's important so that, for example, if you have someone working for you who learns your business, finds your contact list, downloads it, goes off and says, hey, I'm going to start a competing business and I'm going to sell to your customers. So you need to have agreements that say they can't do that. So those are those types of agreements with employees and contractors. If you're working with any third parties, any vendors or something like that, you have to think about, do you need a confidentiality or non-disclosure agreement with them? If you're going to be disclosing any kind of confidential information, you need to have that. If you have an online presence, which everyone does now, you need to have terms of service for your website. And there's a lot of things you can decide about what you want in there. But again, you need to have terms of service. If you are offering a coaching program or a training program, you should have an agreement that sets out kind of the terms of that. So, for example, some people will have in their terms say, hey, that another coach can't take your program. And the reason for that is they don't want a coach to take your program and then, learn from it and then use that information to compete. But, again, you have to decide what you want in those relationships or in those situations. So that's a list of some of them. Again, what I would tell people, though, is that the general rule I would say is if you have any kind of relationship or agreement that's important to your business, it should be in writing. Period. Full stop.
Wow. Okay. Now you are working with the new startups and the newbies online entrepreneurs. Should we all care about the intellectual property from the beginning, or should we worry about once we are in the middle and we are starting to make success?
You should worry about it from the beginning. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But, and again, when I say worry about it, that doesn't mean you have to spend a lot of money to do something. But there are certain things that you need to be thinking about from the beginning. Again, I mentioned having confidentiality clauses, having those types of things in place. You need to be thinking about that from the beginning, because if you don't, well, then your information may not stay confidential. Similarly, so under United States federal law, any federally protected intellectual property, so that would be a trademark or a copyright or an invention for a patent, those rights can only be transferred in writing. So if you have an employee who's doing a lot of that for you, they haven't done a written agreement, and it's particularly an issue in the case of patent rights, and let's say they leave and go work somewhere else. Well, down the road, you're going to have to track that person down, find them, and get them to transfer the rights to you, which you don't want to have to do. So again, you need to think about those things from the beginning. But let me give you another example of something where if you don't think about it from the beginning, it can be a problem, and that's trademarks. And so trademarks relate to your brand. It's anything that designates the source of a good or service. So it could be your brand name, your slogan, your logo, all of those kinds of things. And one of the other big mistakes I see entrepreneurs make is they spend a lot of time coming up with what they think is the perfect name for their business or for their product. They will brainstorm it. They'll spitball with people. They will even test it, go onto the internet and run various tests and split tests to see what works best. And then once they've decided on the name, they don't do anything else. They don't go to see, is someone else already using that name, or has someone else already filed a trademark for that name? And the problem with that is, if someone else does have a trademark, they're not going to find out about it, you using their name at the beginning. They're going to find out once you're successful, once you've spent time, money, effort building your brand. And if you think about it, you don't want to get a letter after you put a year of time and effort and money into building your brand, get a letter that says you have to change your brand name. So that's why you have to think about these things from the beginning. If you don't, you may find yourself in hot water later.
It could be painful. Okay, let's put man aside. How did you know you are successful?
How did I know I was successful?
Yes.
I know I'm successful because I judge it differently than most people. I consider myself successful because I have not missed a single one of my daughter's doctor's appointments, and she's now 3.5. And that's something that's important to me. And that's just a little tidbit that I use to remind myself that, I work. I like what I do, but I work because I have a bigger goal in life. And being successful means being able to spend time with my family and to not miss the big events. And so that's how I judge my success, that I'm able to spend time with my daughter, that she considers me a good dad, that she gets to actually know me, and that I'm not just an absentee father. So that is actually how I know I'm successful. It has nothing to do with money. It has nothing to do with anything else. It's the ability to do those things with my daughter is how I judge my success.
Wow. Okay. Now you work with entrepreneurs. Can anyone be an entrepreneur, or some people are more cut out for it than others?
Well, I think theoretically anyone could be an entrepreneur, but I think there are definitely people who are more cut out for it. You have to be willing to put in work, because especially when you first start out, you will likely be having to do just about everything. When I started my own law firm, it was just me. I didn't have anyone else working for me. I didn't have an assistant. I didn't have anybody else. So if it had to get done, I had to do it. And it was to the point that the first place I worked, literally, the people didn't even come to take out the trash. So I had to take out the trash myself from my first office. So, you're going to have to do things that you don't want to. You're going to have to put in hard hours. You're going to have to be flexible. And if you're just doing it for money or for something else, you're probably not going to succeed, because you need something that keeps a fire lit under you. But I think you can find that if you can find what your why is. Why is it that you're doing this? What is it that gets you excited to be an entrepreneur, to be doing what you do? And it can't be because you want to be your own boss. That's not enough. There has to be something beyond that. But I also think to be an entrepreneur, you have to be someone who can handle failure and can handle criticism, because you are going to make mistakes. There's no way to avoid that. And if you're the type of person who would just end up destroyed by the fact that you made a mistake and that you fail at something, you probably shouldn't be an entrepreneur. Because to be a successful entrepreneur, when you make a mistake or you have a failure, you need to get right back up and get right back on the horse and start riding it again. And that's the key, I think, is to be persistent and to be willing to fight through your failures.
What keeps you grounded?
Well, my daughter is a large part of what keeps me grounded. But I also, part of it is working with entrepreneurs. And one of the things I think it's different about me, or that changed about me. So lawyers are really, they're pretty bad at being marketers normally. To most lawyers, a marketing plan is going to networking events with other lawyers, maybe participating in some professional groups with other lawyers, writing papers or articles for other lawyers to read. And that's about it. So, you just kind of talk with your colleagues. And I used to do that. That used to be my approach. And the funny thing is that's never what I was suited for. And part of what keeps me grounded now is I don't do that. I don't write for any type of legal journals or articles read by lawyers. I don't participate in lawyer networking events. I talk to entrepreneurs. I listen to what they have to say, and I provide information to them. And I think that keeps me grounded because it keeps me based and keeps me in touch with the people that I'm actually talking to and serving. And I think that's an important way to keep yourself grounded.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you said you had mentors when you started your business. Do you still have mentors?
Well, so I didn't have a coach when I first started. I had a coach after I'd been in business for a while, and working with her in a sense got me moving in the right direction. But she was a lawyer who was, an ex-lawyer who now worked with lawyers to help them build their business. So, and again, she was very much in the mold. She was not purely go talk to lawyers and do that, but a lot of her advice was the old standard advice for lawyers. It wasn't, go online and learn the ways of online marketing and inbound marketing and all that. But she put me on the right path. I mean, she's what set me down the rabbit hole of learning these things. I'm currently working with a coach to help me in developing my my online course I'm developing, because again, I'm a lawyer, so I naturally think a little bit too much like a lawyer and not enough like an entrepreneur sometimes. And so working with someone I think is helpful. But also, I mean, it happens to be that this coach is theoretically among the type of person who would be among my client or among my customers. So it helps to have someone like that helping you develop these courses, because again, that'll keep you grounded and keep you working in the right way. So that I think is important, and it's a relationship that that I consider a very important relationship. It's more of a kind of a coach or a sounding board. As for mentors, I get mentorship through listening to podcasts, through reading what people have to say, and that's how I would say I get most of my mentorship.
What is the most valuable thing your mentor has told you?
Well, so it was the advice of really niching down and finding a specialty. That was until I made that shift in my business, I wasn't successful, and I never would have been successful, because before that, I was trying to talk to too many people. I couldn't have a unified message, but also even my friends, family, and former colleagues, they didn't even really know what I did, because I did a little bit of everything. And so now, on the other hand, I can tell someone what I do in 5 seconds, and they know, and it's a very clear message. So they can immediately put me in this box and say, hey, if I come across someone who needs that I'm going to send them to Bobby. It's the same thing when I'm doing marketing online. I can talk to my customers because I know who my customers are, and I can talk to them about what my particular area of focus is. So I think that's the most useful piece of advice I ever got.
What is the most valuable thing you have ever given away?
I think I give away quite a bit, so it's hard to answer that. I give away quite a bit of content online to people. I give of my time. I often will, talk with people for a long time. But I think probably the most valuable thing I give is I'm one of the few lawyers, I think, who tells people not to hire me. I often have someone call me and they want to hire me to do something, and I say it just doesn't make sense to hire me. You can get it done much more cheaply by hiring this person. This isn't something that you need to be paying my hourly rate for. You should pay this much cheaper, kind of a factory type of things on, for example, getting a trademark. Paying me to file a trademark application for you just doesn't make sense. Because I charge too much for that. There are companies that do it very cheaply, and you might as well hire them instead of me. So I think that's the most valuable thing I give is I tell clients or potential clients all the time not to hire me.
Wow. Okay. Let's talk about your online free course you are creating. How is it going to help us? And tell us a bit more about it.
Well, so the course I'm developing, it's going to be called Safeguard Your Online Genius, and it will have a number of modules which will kind of walk through the steps that every online business should be taking. And it's focused on online content creators. So think coaches, people who kind of are experts in their field, course creators, podcasters, all of those kinds of people who are building a platform. And for those people, probably 95% of the value of their business is their intellectual property. They may not realize it, but that's the case. I mean, it's their content they're creating, it's their information, it's their know-how. That is their business. And so the purpose of the course will be to walk them through developing everything they need to do. So again, for example, all those written contracts they need to get, but also what to do about trademarks, how to develop policies and procedures to make sure you're not stepping on anyone else's rights, how to have the right agreements in place with people. And it will have a bunch of templates. There will be documents that people will get as part of it that instead of having to pay a lawyer or hunt around online and hope you find a good template, there will be templates that you'll know basically you can fill in, customize to your situation, and use for your own business. And so that's the main point. There will be sections about terms of service, about social media policies, et cetera. And it will basically walk online entrepreneurs through what they need to do and give them the actual documents or template documents that they can, in working through the course and listening to these lessons, will be able to customize to their situation and get everything they need in place to make sure they own all of their intellectual property, that they've taken steps to protect it, and that they're not stepping on landmines that could get them sued by infringing someone else's intellectual property.
Would you be like having a one-to-one support? Or
well, so I will have in the standard course, I'm intending to have something like I would call it office hours, but kind of a live Q&A session where anyone who's part of that can get on for an hour a week. I will have a more premium course or premium version where there will be one-on-one training. And what I have in mind to do is that I will have so there will be 6 substantive modules where you're creating something. And so to have 6 one-hour sessions with me that the people would take after they have gone through the lesson themselves, then we will spend that hour together where we would actually do the work or get started on the work of taking those template documents and getting them in place or getting them customized for their business. So that's going to be a more premium offering. I could also do the complete do it for you where you don't have to do anything, but that gets very expensive, obviously, because if I have to create everything custom for you, get in and really dig through your business and understand everything, that's going to be more costly. And it may be cost prohibitive, but for people who would like that, they will have that option as well.
Wow. Okay. So where do we find your course?
Well, so it's not available yet. It'll be available later this summer, but for now, people can find access. I have a free e-course about creating a plan for your business, which they can find on my website at klinkllc.com/podcast. And so it's KLINCKLLC.com/podcast. And from there, they can sign up for a free course about intellectual property planning. It's you'll get 4 emails with links and videos and some free downloads, including a free download of one of my books. You get all that information. If you do that, you'll get on my contact list, and then you'll find out when the course is going live. I'm in addition to when the course goes live, I anticipate running a contest probably starting next week, but I haven't decided for sure, where I will give people the opportunity to become beta testers in my course. I'm going to have 10 people who will get to go through the course absolutely free. They will actually have a lot more one-on-one time with me, because part of this is to make sure that that I'm answering the questions that most entrepreneurs are going to need answered, and make sure that it's going to be successful for folks. But so that people will have the ability to get access to absolutely free. They won't have to pay the sticker price for the course, which will likely be around $2,000 for the course, but they'll get it for free. So if they get on my list, they'll hear about that as well and have an opportunity to sign up for that.
Okay. Have you learned any lessons about business the hard way?
Yeah. Not having that written agreement at my prior firm, I definitely learned the hard way. Although, again, in some ways, I'm very happy that it happened. I don't have regrets, because I would be living a very different life if I had that written agreement. I would be doing something very different than what I do now, probably. So I don't regret it, but I definitely learned that lesson the hard way. I've also learned other lessons the hard way, more traditional things of, when you are at a point where you're, I don't want to say desperate, but somewhere near desperate for money or a client, you end up taking on bad customers and bad clients, and they're never worth it. I've had that happen where, I put in tons and tons of time and ended up not getting paid for it. So that was a mistake I made on the front end, because I was excited and, he gave me a small retainer check up front. And then that was the only money I ever saw from this client. So, I've learned lessons about that and to trust my gut and trust my instinct. If someone sounds like maybe I shouldn't take them on as a client. I don't. But again, those are the kinds of lessons you'll have to learn on your own. But I think those are some of the important ones. But also, find what you love. For a long time as a lawyer, I don't want to say I wasn't happy, but I just wasn't all that happy because I wasn't doing something that I loved. And once I found my real purpose, my why, it really changed and it made me much happier.
Wow. Okay. So, Clan, there will be more from Robert in a moment. If you are finding Robert's journey interesting and you are ready to hear more, come and listen to the full version of the interview at onlinesuccessjourney.com. If you are on Online Success Journey already, click on part 2 of Robert's journey and you'll get lots more tips how to go into law and protect your intellectual properties and more on online. And don't forget, you can also access all the other Online Success Journey interview podcasts on the site as well. That's a wrap, Clan. Remember, success is a journey. Patience and Robert.
This is not the end of the journey. We hope you've enjoyed listening to part 1 and want to be sure you know there is a second part to this and every journey podcast at onlinesuccessjourney.com. filled with even more success tips, uplifting stories, and even a bit of fun. There are dozens of episodes only available to the members of the Online Success Journey clan. Check out the website and click on Join the Clan for more information. Patience would like to thank you for listening to this podcast, and she has a free audio gift for you at her website. Go to onlinesuccessjourney.com for instant access to this gift. Of course, you know that listening to the journeys of others helps each of us chart our own path. So make sure you're subscribed to be notified as each new interview is posted. There are so many ways to stay connected to the Online Success Journey and to listen in. And if you're enjoying the podcast, we appreciate your help in telling others. One of the best ways to share the benefit you get is to rate and review it at Stitcher and other sites by clicking the stars or completing the ratings form, by clicking thumbs up and leaving a comment on YouTube, or liking and sharing the podcast on social media. To review the podcast within iTunes, simply open iTunes to the podcast, click on Ratings and Reviews, then write a review. On behalf of Patience, and until next time, thanks once more for listening. It is our hope that this podcast will guide you on your own online success journey.